All right, let's turn our monitors back to the White House now, where President Trump and Irish leader Micheál just wrapped up a meeting in the Oval Office. The two leaders answered a number of questions from reporters. And next on the schedule, early St. Patrick's Day celebrations on Capitol Hill. That's happening in just a few hours. We'll have those remarks once they begin. But I want to bring in CBS News White House correspondent Olivia Rinaldi, who's been following this meeting between President Trump and Ireland's Prime Minister there. What stood out to you?
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Liz. They just had this Oval Office bilateral meeting, Trump meeting with the Prime Minister of Ireland, also known as the Taoiseach. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. We've been practicing that here. A couple of things I want to point out from this meeting that we just heard of from President Trump, specifically on that very delicate situation and ceasefire right now between Ukraine and Russia. We, of course, know yesterday that Ukraine said they'd be open to a 30-day ceasefire. Now it's on to the Russians to see if they're going to agree with that. Trump addressing that delicate ceasefire, saying we have half of a ceasefire. Now we need Russia to sign it. He didn't assess any chance of Putin really signing that deal or what concessions would need to be made. He said, I think it makes sense for Russia to sign it. He said they've also discussed potentially a land deal as a result of that as well. That caught my attention as something we should be watching in the coming weeks. But then Trump said we don't want to be wasting time talking about this while we're here. I do want to point out that this morning the Taoiseach had breakfast with Vice President Vance. Secretary Kennedy was also in attendance there, and he spoke about Ukraine in that meeting, where he said in Ukraine, he said that Ireland, rather, is ready to play their part in supporting work to end the conflict in Ukraine and secure peace in Ukraine, Middle East, or elsewhere. So a couple of top lines there just on foreign policy. On policies between the two countries, though, we know, as Kelly just said, the EU slapped about $28 billion worth of tariffs on the U.S. today for typical American products, from Levi's to Harley Davidson. Trump addressed that in that Oval Office meeting, saying the EU's been very tough, and it's our turn too. We get a turn at being tough on them. Trump also said that the U.S. has a massive deficit with Ireland. He said Ireland was very smart and they took our pharmaceutical companies away, and said that a lot of these tariffs and these reciprocal tariffs that the EU is placing on us has caused ill will between the U.S. and the EU. So a lot of tough tension there, talking about tariffs in that Oval Office meeting. But as you mentioned, these two leaders are now heading up to Capitol Hill for a very chummy event with the Friends of Ireland up on Capitol Hill today.
Now, as all of this is happening, Olivia, major questions remain unanswered about the Department of Education. Officials say nearly 50% of the workforce will be cut from that department. What can you tell us?
Yeah, this is developing today. We're learning about half of the workforce of the Department of Education is starting to be let go and fired. Just to give you a sense of how many people work in this department, it's only about 4,000, a little over 4,000. Very small compared to other government agencies around D.C. that can billow into several thousand worth of workers that are there. So comparatively a smaller agency, but actually Secretary Linda McMahon last night was on Fox News, where she talked about this being essentially the first step in shuttering this agency. This is something Trump has said he's wanted to do. It's something Republicans have said they've wanted to do for a long time, since President Reagan's era, when this department was created. But I should note, it takes an act of Congress to get rid of this department. It was created by an act of Congress. It's going to take one to get rid of it, but still the Trump administration seems to be plowing ahead with shuttering it and sending education back to the states, as they like to say. Still a lot of questions about what that actually looks like, since this department usually just handles federal grants, financial aid, and sets guidelines and recommendations about teaching practices. They're not mandating what education looks like from the federal government down. So a lot of questions specifically about what shuttering this agency is going to look like, particularly in the realm of financial aid. That's what I'm most interested in hearing this, and how that's going to impact some college students around the country.
Yeah, it takes an act of Congress to completely dismantle it, but it looks like the Trump administration is taking it apart piece by piece.
Yeah. Yeah, and they want to take this fight to the courts. That's kind of been what we've been seeing, especially with, USAID being shuttered several weeks ago, and now we saw that got folded into the State Department, and then officially we saw Secretary Rubio, cancel about 83% of their federal contracts. Now that they've taken it and folded it into the State Department, it's really at their will to do what they want with it, but there's still lawsuits playing out about whether or not they still owe the money that they allocated in these federal contracts, and those were allocated by Congress. So a lot of questions playing out around, at this very granular level about what government actually looks like and what's the role of each branch of government, right? Congress appropriates, the executive branch, does executive orders, and the president serves in that capacity. But we see this president certainly expanding what his executive role is with the power of the pen, but it's Congress that holds the power of the purse. And ultimately, we'll be watching to see how all of these lawsuits around the shuttering of various agencies in Washington, D.C. work out.
All right, Olivia Rinaldi, thanks so much. Good to be with you.